Hey, this is Carl. Quick question for you. What's the hardest thing you ever had to do in business? Well, I can tell you, the second hardest thing I ever did was the first time I had to fire somebody. The third hardest thing I ever did was when I realized I should have fired somebody and I didn't. But the single hardest thing I ever did as a small business owner, because the pain never stops, is managing salespeople. Welcome to episode 22 of the Cheeky Sales Coach, Managing Salespeople. So here's 6 or 7 things you need to know about managing salespeople. Thing number 1, there has to be an ROI. Remember I said that in marketing you don't have to have an ROI because marketing is an expense. You don't really get to measure money coming in the door because of marketing. You want to, you try to, you want to measure performance, but you can't measure money coming in the door. Sales must have an ROI, and a salesperson in particular must have an ROI. Salespeople are expensive. So if somebody, let's say that, we'll just throw out the number $75,000. Somebody wants to make $75,000. How do you pay them, and how do you make more money than that? In your brain, you got to figure out, am I paying this person from profit, which means this is $75,000 profit on the things they sell? Or am I just paying this as some kind of a salary and they have to bring in more than 75? The reason you have to really go through this in your head is if they sell $75,000 worth of stuff and make $75,000 profit, and you pay them $75,000 plus benefits, you haven't broken even yet. You probably got to sell $100,000 to break even. What would $100,000 in extra sales mean to your business? Because now you have to deliver those services and you haven't made any extra profit, right? You have an extra $100,000 in sales, but you spent it on the salesperson. So when you talk about ROI, return on investment, there must be a significant ROI to make sure that the salesperson is paying for themselves. If you can't crack that nut, stop trying to hire a salesperson. At the end of this video, I'm going to tell you the secret of all time, which is if you're in small business, the owner probably has to do all the sales most of the time for a long, long time, maybe decades. It's hard to crack the nut of making profit with a salesperson. That's why it's so hard to manage them. Let's look at some of the reasons why that's true. Thing number 2, you have to balance their base pay and commission. So again, let's say somebody wants to make that $75,000 take home. Do you start them out with a large base? Many companies do. Now, what constitutes large? Do you want to give them just enough to pay the rent, keep them hungry, or do you want to give them enough so that they're not hungry and they can focus on their work? So let's say that you give them a base of $3,000 a month. Well, that's $36,000 a year. Believe it or not, there are people living on $36,000 a year. So they're definitely not hungry, although they may not be driving around in a Mercedes-Benz. So now they've got to earn an extra $40,000 to reach their goal. So that is made off of commission. Now, if you shrink the size of the base, you have to increase the size of the commission. So they've got to perform. Now, in a perfect world, you will find salespeople who are really good at what they do, and they will insist on a commission-only structure. In other words, they will insist that the entire 75 is paid on commission and paid as a percentage of the profit on what they sell. How much is that? Well, we talked before, and you can look at the earlier videos. Essentially, you're going to probably be in the range of 10% of gross or 30% of profit is what you're going to pay for a salesperson. So it is a significant amount of money, but when you do those calculations, that person who wants to take $75,000 home, 100% commission, had better be able to sell $750,000 worth of new services. In fact, the profit has to be $750,000. Now, I said you have to balance the base and commission. You probably want to start out with somebody who's got some kind of a base so that you know that they don't have to go take another job to be able to pay the bills and don't have time to do sales. So that, what's the minimum base? But you can't let them sit on their laurels, right? They cannot just simply hang out in your office and not make sales. So you have to have some kind of a process to get them out and moving towards sales. So think about that again. Again, there's lots of just plain thinking time involved in all of this. So the bottom line, so to speak, on pay is that you have to have a plan to get started. You have to have a plan to transition over time, and you have to have the long-term plan. And with luck, you'll find somebody who will stick with you and be dedicated to your business and to your prospects and will bring you along on that trip. Thing 3 and thing 4 are directly related to each other. Thing 3 is it takes a lot of money to get started. It takes a lot of money to get a salesperson up to speed. Thing 4 is that you have to fire fast if they're not working out. So these two are juxtaposed to one another because it's really expensive to make mistakes. On the side of training, bringing somebody on board, remember, I just said you got to have this long drawn out process of getting them started, giving them a bunch of money when they're not bringing in any sales. They've got to have specific goals and targets, and they've got to hit those targets. And if they don't, then you got to get rid of them and find somebody who will hit those targets. The targets aren't arbitrary. This isn't a test. This is their job. This is what they have to do in order to continue to work with your company. So you have to spend the money up front developing a process, defining your process, introducing them to all of your prospects, bringing them up to speed on the funnel, helping them to build their own funnel, helping them to build their own process for working with clients, working with prospects, making sales. They have to learn your catalog, they have to learn your people, they have to know what you sell, and they have to make sure they sell the right thing. That costs a lot of time, which is money. You're going to take your time, you're going to take time from the service department, you might have time from other salespeople, time from the front office. It's really expensive to bring people up to speed on making sales for you. So if they don't hit their targets, you really have to get rid of them really, really fast. This is the hardest part, in my opinion, is that in small business, we do business with just a few people. By definition, a small business only has a handful of employees. You have a small clientele. You get to know them. You like them. They become your friends. And so over time, you get to know them and like them and trust them, and you don't want to fire them. But at the end of the day, if it costs you a whole bunch of money, you can't have somebody who is only a cost center, doesn't deliver service, doesn't bring in new clients, doesn't bring money in the door. Unfortunately, you have to balance these two, and that is a very difficult thing, especially if you hire somebody and they don't work out and you got to fire them, and then you got to hire somebody else and you got to train them and they don't work out and you got to, da-da-da-da-da. You might find yourself hiring, training, and firing 3 people in a year and spending a ridiculous amount of money doing it. So go slow, hire carefully, do little small steps that will keep you profitable if you can. Number 5, beware the biggest pitfall of all time when it comes to sales: making the wrong sales. What are the wrong sales? Well, there's two types of wrong sales. One is that somebody sells the wrong thing. They sell products and services that are not quite what you want to deliver. They sell something that you don't actually sell. They sell something you don't want to sell, or they make promises you can't keep. So bad sales, the wrong sales, can be very unprofitable. Sometimes when you motivate people with money, what happens is that they sell something and they have a thinner and thinner and thinner margin because they don't care, because they're going to get the sales commission. A lot of times when you think about your relationship with your distributors and manufacturers, you might have seen that most of the problems you have in that relationship is because their salespeople want their commission, and so it leads them to make bad decisions. Somebody is paying that salesperson. Now, the other kind of wrong sales is selling to the wrong clients. Think about, if somebody is not quite a good fit for your company, they either ask too much, they're not very manageable, they don't do business the way you do business. What happens is, after their first contract is over, they leave and they go somewhere else. So now you have paid somebody for the commission on that sale and the client left. Now you have to pay that somebody again to earn the commission to get a replacement client. Basically, you've gone down the wrong road when X% of your annual sales are replacing clients who shouldn't have been sold in the first place. Again, in small business, most of us want to do business with somebody for 5 or 10 years. We don't want to have a 1-year, 2-year relationship. So if you've got a constant churn in your clientele, somebody is selling the wrong clients. Side note, if you don't have a salesperson and you're still having churn, you may be selling to the wrong clients all by yourself. So it's not like only salespeople make this mistake. Lots of us make this mistake. Once you recognize it, you have to figure out, how do we fix it and not sell to the wrong people again? Thing number 6, you have to have a really good sales process. And if you don't have one, you got to build one. Ideally, 2 things will happen. First, you will have a sales process in place before you hire a salesperson, so you can train them up on your process. Second, it would be ideal if a salesperson helped you to fine-tune and improve the process. Over in the world of technology, one of my rules is that we have a checklist for everything, and the last item on every checklist is update the checklist. In other words, we believe in a system of constant incremental improvement. Every time you go through a process, you should make that process a little bit better. That includes the sales process. So if you've got a salesperson who can help you improve the sales process, that would be the perfect world. I started by talking about the challenges of working with salespeople. So let me just come to the end by telling you it can also be a wonderful, glorious thing if you have the right salesperson. They sell the right stuff. They're totally motivated in improving your processes. They're committed to your company, and they make a whole bunch of money because you get to keep most of it. They get their share, you get your share. Everything goes very, very smoothly. Now, the most important thing. Thing number 7, when you take all of these things into consideration, the bottom line is the owner must do sales until you figure out your process, until you figure out your clientele, until you figure out where you get new clients, how you get new clients, which sales offers work, which marketing works, which sales programs work. You have to figure that out before you hire a salesperson. Otherwise, you will be spending most of their exorbitant salary figuring out what works. So, like it or not, I told you I'd come back to this at the end. The owner in a small business is probably going to be the primary salesperson for many, many years and maybe even forever. So a lot of people say, well, I don't like sales. Well, you got to figure out how to make sales if you want to stay in business. Large companies can have lots of salespeople because they have to spend a certain amount of money to get new clients. They're willing to waste some of that. They're willing to put thousands or tens of thousands of dollars into training programs for each employee. It's very expensive to have salespeople on staff. So if you're too small, one of the things that you can do to make a bunch of money in the short term is to set aside the dream of hiring outside sales and just go make those sales yourself. That may not be something you want to hear, but trust me, it will be very profitable if you decide to do it. For the Cheeky Sales Coach, this is Carl Palachuk, wishing you absolutely the best of luck in everything you do. Call to action. Like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss a thing.